Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
And I'm Michaela, human being, here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
We are back with another exciting edition of Booktalking. It's a special holiday edition.
Holiday edition!
Yes, it's our very first one. It's themed and everything.
It's themed, I know.
Yes.
It's very exciting. And with one of my favorite Christmas stories, we're doing Christmas this time round. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. We did admit this one from our Dickens spectacular.
Which was funny because we talked about Dickens for several weeks and never mentioned Christmas Carol.
We were saving it.
I know. Not intentionally, but... that is by far Dickens' most famous piece.
Yeah.
If you know nothing else about Dickens, you've at least heard of Christmas Carol. It has been adapted and readapted thousands of times.
Even the Muppets did it.
The Muppets did a very good job
Yes,
of it.
they did.
In case anyone in the free world isn't familiar with Christmas Carol, it's about a miser named Ebenezer Scrooge, who is a mean, hard-hearted man who hates Christmas. And he's visited by three spirits. One of them takes him back to previous Christmases, in which he sees himself as a child.
Yep.
And another one that goes to Christmas present takes him to people around London celebrating, particularly the people who work for him and his relatives, his poor relatives. And he sees the travels that they'll go through on Christmas Day. And then finally he sees Christmas in the future, in which he sees his own death.
Yep. And the harsh reality of that if he continues living his life the way he's been living it.
Exactly. It brings up a lot of powerful themes. Let's see. Charles Dickens wrote it in 1843 when he was only 31 years old. And at 31, he had already become a titan of the literary world. He'd written several huge books. However, he hadn't had a big hit since Oliver Twist, I think.
Yeah,
He'd been several years, and he spent a lot of money, and he hadn't had a big hit in a couple of years, so he really needed a good book.
And hey, this one came along. I mean, I don't think there's a person around who doesn't know the story, but if you don't, oh my God, read this story.
It's full of the usual Charles Dickens, fantastically named characters and great dialogue and descriptions of things. He wrote it in a frenzy in 6 weeks. His publisher wasn't interested in it, so he had to self-publish it.
Yep, and he did it through, he published it in serials through the newspaper again, right?
Yeah, but putting it out in one volume turned out to be a huge mistake because he wasn't experienced in publishing, so he wound up losing money on it. It sold out in only 8 days, but he made very little money because the book was incredibly lavish by the Times.
Yeah.
Original editions of it go for between $10,000 and $20,000. For instance, it has gilt embossing on the cover and hand tinted pictures on the inside. Actually hand colored at a factory. These poor women painted in these things. And that cost money because I'm sure he paid them well, being Dickens. And it cost so much money that even though he sold out of every single copy in no time, he still didn't make any money off it, really.
Well, it costs money to be that lavish.
Exactly. And within a year, right, or for next Christmas, there was already at least 8 different stage productions going. Unauthorized, of course. He made no money off those either.
Oh, yeah. I've been in a couple different versions of Christmas Carol.
Many, like Trinity Repertoire Company in Providence, does it every year.
Every single year.
Annual tradition, Oh,
I know. They do the cattle call audition at Cardi's for all the kids.
Yeah. It's an amazing story. One thing that surprised me was it's not terribly long, but most versions of it are still shortened. They leave out a bunch of things. I listened to a 10-hour audiobook by Tim Curry. I discovered it significantly longer than most of the other audiobook versions. In my library, we have a superb version by Jim Dale, a fantastic actor. That's only 3.5 hours long.
Oh yeah, I listened to, in preparation for this, of course, I've read the novel, but I was listening to a wonderful radio play. It had a ton of very famous British actors in it. It had Jenna Coleman, a ton of people in it. It it was just under 4 hours.
Yeah.
And it did cut out a lot. I mean, every version of it does. It kind of just buttons it, gets right to the point, the short and quick of it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of descriptive language in this novel.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it mentions the texture of the snow no less than a dozen times.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Dickens really sets a beautiful scene, and there's this kind of like light levity and humor in every little interaction that happens. It feels very real, even the language that people use.
It feels very accurate. One critic pointed out that for something that's supposedly a Christmas story, Dickens never mentions religion, ever.
Yeah, no.
However, he mentions food in almost every scene. Every time you enter a scene, he always describes what people are eating at length.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, even from the pitiful gruel that Scrooge is eating. Even when he sees Marley, which we didn't really talk about Marley, but the ghost of his deceased business partner, who they were very similar, very alike in mind of making money. So they were very, very similar people who died 7 Christmas Eves past. Is the first ghost to visit Scrooge, who tells him,
"That's true. I missed
you're
him
going
entirely."
to you missed a ghost."
Yeah.
But he's the one who tells Scrooge, like, this is what's going to happen. These ghosts are going to visit you. He carries around these big chains, basically saying, I forged each of these links with all my misdeeds, and you have been living for 7 years longer than I have, so yours is even worse. Even Scrooge is just like, you're just a bit of undigested beef, an undercooked potato, like tries to explain it all away.
Yeah, his journey from skeptic to true believer is a realistic one. It's worked very well. I think actors love playing it because you do get that transformation. By the end, you're playing a person who's the same person but still completely different. It has attracted tremendous amounts of actors. George C. Scott, Albert Finney, Patrick Stewart, famously. Jim Carrey did a version. Henry Winkler did a version. And, of course, Michael Caine in the Muppet Christmas Carol.
And he does such a good job.
He is fantastic.
Once you're over 55, if you're a male actor, you have to, it's like you need to play Ebenezer Scrooge.
Yeah, in the Disney version, Scrooge is played by Scrooge McDuck, which is real typecasting.
But hey, listen, he did a great job.
He did. He was very good in that part. It is hugely popular. It's the most popular Christmas story ever. Dickens was in some ways very fortunate in that he caught a sort of rising wave of Christmas, because Christmas, for the most part, wasn't that big in England. It hadn't been for a long time. It was celebrated, of course, and you went to church on Christmas Day, but it was mostly a family celebration. Where you get together with all of your family and friends, and you sing songs. The adults drink adult beverages, and the children play games. And it's
you
more
have a
like
good meal. It's time for family.
It's a lot more like what Americans do for Thanksgiving. And Christmas does have a long and checkered history, being banned and outlawed in many places. Oliver Cromwell banned it from England. There was already an attempt to bring back Christmas as a major holiday before Dickens wrote this, so he was very lucky. Weirdly, from what I've been researching, in 1843 there was a longing for the good old days, if you can imagine that. In 1843, they already felt that England was moving in the wrong direction because this country had become industrialized. Everybody was leaving the country and moving into the city to work in these big factories, and they were afraid they were losing something that made them quintessentially English. And so there was a public consciousness of reaching back towards things that they had lost. And one of the things they lost was Christmas. Christmas was celebrated going like way, way back on the calendar. They had a lot of lavish feasts, royalty did, and that trickled down to the poor people as well. But for the most part, it was a royal tradition, was having a big Christmas. Elizabeth I had a goose at Christmas famously, and that started a real tradition of the Christmas goose that still goes on in England. So they're reaching that far back in time to find these traditions. That happened to be, by coincidence, the first Christmas card was also published around the same time Dickens wrote his book.
The same year, 1843.
The same year, 1843. A rich guy who was a printer realized he had so many friends, instead of saying hello and good luck to all of them, he just printed up. He found an old picture and printed up, have a happy season, and mailed them off to all of his friends. And it started a huge trend. In a few years, everybody was sending Christmas cards. So Dickens was lucky, which was good because he needed the money. And in fact, after its first printing lost money, it would go on and become a perennial moneymaker. For the rest of Dickens' life, until he was old and gray, he would give public readings of this every Christmas. That was his bread and butter for a long time.
I mean, hey, that works out. Ebenezer Scrooge, that cash cow.
Yeah, Scrooge would be proud of that, I think. What is it about the book that strikes you?
I really like the juxtaposition of Scrooge, who is living, he has all of this money and is living like a miser. Like, he is spending none of it. He's living in the old apartments that Jacob Marley actually used to live in. He literally just moved in to his dead partner's old office, old suite of rooms. And then you've got the Cratchits, who, though they have nothing, their home is always described as warm. Yeah. And I like Dickens, the way he describes the spaces in this novel to kind of convey the emotional state that's happening. Everything around Scrooge's life is very gray, very cold. They describe the chill in the air, like how his fire is very small. Everything in his life is just dark. He doesn't mind the darkness because darkness is cheap.
Darkness is cheap. I know, that's a very good quote, yeah.
And everything is light and warmth.
Everywhere else he goes, it's
light and it's warmth. And he starts to warm up too as the time goes on. I love the flashback scenes. Particularly, my favorite side character are the Fezziwigs. Yeah, I love the Fezziwigs. Hysterical. So when Scrooge is a young man, he is doing his apprenticeship for Mr. Fezziwig, and of course it's Christmas because the ghost of Christmas past is taking him through all of the Christmas pasts he had, and it's Fezziwig, and Fezziwig is this respected, successful businessman who everyone loves and is this just joyful, jovial sort of person. He's an older person, but they're describing him dancing like he's clicking his heels together like he's a young man.
He's a really great guy and a good boss.
And takes care of his employees and his apprentices. And it's kind of funny because that's who Scrooge is kind of meant, that's his mentor. That's who he should have ended up like, and yet look at how he ended up. So it's kind of like how if you cut yourself off from other people, you lose empathy. Well, this is what your life will become. You need those other people. You need the warmth. You need humanity. You need empathy. You need caring and forgiveness and all these wonderful things that, people tend to focus more on during Christmas, and that's why I think he picked Christmas as the setting.
Yeah, Christmas is about family and things like that.
It's warmth and being kind to your fellow man. Which is something this character has lost. So I like the way that is the reason. There's an emotional journey here. There's an emotional journey here with this character that is thawing his cold heart rather than I need to be better because if not, I'm going to wind up wandering through eternity with these chains that are even longer than Jacob Marley's. But there's a real journey there instead of just you need to fix it or you're going to hell.
Exactly. One thing that struck me was it's always called a children's story. However,
there's nothing really childish
about it. There's nothing childish about it. For one thing, many of the ghosts are genuinely terrifying. It doesn't hold back on the horror aspects of it, and Dickens is a very evocative writer. And also, it's about second chances. It's about the mistakes that you've made in your life. I don't think children in general have lived long enough to actually ponder those questions.
Well, it's looking back on your life and what regrets do you have?
Yeah, exactly.
A 10-year-old's not going to just be like, well, I should have studied harder for my science test.
And it deals with facing your own inevitable death, which again is something most little kids can't really wrap their heads around. It is definitely a story aimed at adults.
Yeah, I think what a child will get out of it is maybe teach them about sharing, just being kind and maybe learning empathy. This is definitely a story for adults. You get so much more out of it.
Patrick Stewart said to him the theme of the story is second chances.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And I admit when I was listening to the audiobook, I got kind of choked up at a few points. I thought it made me think about my own life and the choices that I made, which is pretty powerful stuff. One thing about it, though, it is considered to be universally loved. Some people don't like it.
Some people don't like it?
That's true.
Kick them out.
No. Well, it created this, I think it's responsible for a lot of the obsessiveness where we have to celebrate Christmas. You don't have to celebrate Christmas.
You don't have to celebrate. It happens at Christmas, but it's not really a Christmas.
Yeah, he could have done it without Christmas, but he did choose Christmas, and because that has become so associated with the season, I think today there's a lot more Scrooges than there were in Dickens' time, because it's really easy to get sick of Christmas in this day and age.
Yeah.
You can watch an hour of TV and see 50 different commercials for expensive things, and particularly when you're a little kid and you want that expensive toy for Christmas, and you figure out pretty early that like there's a different Santa for rich kids than there is for poor kids.
Yeah.
There's lots of reasons that we don't need to embrace Christmas as much as our society does. And also, is the book anti-Semitic? Is it a slam against non-Christians?
Well, the fact there is some religious imagery within the book, but at its core, it really isn't. It's more like a morality story. I see this more as of an Aesop's fable, really, than anything else.
It's been called a humanist tale.
Yeah.
And we all know from our discussion of Oliver Twist that Dickens was not above using Jewish stereotypes. And Scrooge is a classic Jewish stereotype. He's greedy, rapacious, has a hooked nose, and doesn't celebrate Christmas. Which he did not give him any other specific Jewish traits that would have made it obvious, but just those are the classic Jewish stereotypes. So it's easy to see why it falls into that tropes. Although many people point out, like I said, the lack of religious imagery in it points to it not really being a book about anti-Semitic.
Honestly, when I was reading through it, the biggest religious imagery that you really get is Scrooge's fireplace. Like it's got tiles with different religious scenes all over it. But it's really just more like biblical imagery rather than really a metaphor for anything.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Christmas was a religious holiday, and in our society it's become largely a secular one.
Oh, it's commercialized.
It's commercialized. Even when I was a kid, I was raised as an atheist. So we celebrated Christmas because, I wanted presents, and so my parents would give them to me.
It's a fun holiday to get together with. It's basically an excuse to hang out with the family.
It's an excuse to hang out with your family, exactly. So it can be stripped of all of its religious connotations, and the story still works. One critic called it a humanist tale.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Absolutely,
very good way of looking at it. I had pondered, looking at the section toward the end where he foresees his own death. Was this the first story about predestination, where a character, deliberately makes a choice as to how his future will turn out?
Yeah, I mean, it's,
I can't think of an earlier one.
Yeah, it's really outside of Greek myth and you've got the oracles who foresee your death and self-fulfilling prophecy. This is the opposite of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it's the opposite. He's specifically told that this will happen if you follow the path you're on.
Yeah, no, it's literally you're going from point A to point B. Why don't we try going to point C?
Yeah.
Why don't we try? Yeah. There is a different way. There is a different way. They don't tell him to do anything differently. They just say, this is how it's heading. I really, before the 1840s, if there really was a story, this, though, did spin off a ton of different stories with that kind of, if you could glimpse into the future, what would you change?
Yeah, I think it started a kind of a trend. The concept of predestination is a fascinating one. H.G. Wells in Time Machine never even really considers it. It's not.
I would say by that logic, it's less of a religious story. It's just proving that this is not a religious story, because if you go by the belief at that time, well, God decides everything and everything is predetermined and you can't fight fate.
Yeah.
This is literally fighting fate.
Exactly. Yeah. The book was inspired by a lot of different things. Dickens personally loved Christmas because he loved hanging out with his kids and his family and so forth. And he needed a hit book, so there was a lot of pressure on him at the time. He had gone to Manchester and looked at the children working in factories and was appalled and horrified. Social justice, as we call it today, was a major theme of a lot of his works. And I think if you had asked Dickens at the time he was publishing it what the theme of it was, he would say it's about, he's protesting the treatment of children in factories and the poor treatment of workers by management. So it's really a book about working people.
Well, the main characters in this story are the adults. Why don't we focus a little bit on the children in this book? Because there are quite a few different types of children within this book. Of course, there is the ever-famous Tiny Tim.
Tiny Tim, yeah.
But also, the other Cratchits, even Scrooge himself as a young man, it really does show the way children were living in this time period. There's even a couple side scenes where it cuts to him experiencing people in line at the baker's to get to use the oven so they can cook their Christmas meal. And there's like poor children running around.
That's a nice little touch.
Yeah, it's freezing cold and these children are like running around without shoes on, and there's that. There's the Cratchit children. The oldest daughter is already working in she's making bonnets. She's an apprentice. And she's late for Christmas because she's working day of, and she's talking about how she's excited because tomorrow she's going to have the day off and she's going to sleep in. And the oldest son, Peter, he's described as a small boy, but he's wearing one of his father's shirts and it's muffling his mouth because the collar is so high, and they don't get too excited, but we might have had a job for him. It'll pay him 5 whole shillings a week. And then you've got, of course, Tiny Tim, who is their youngest child and severely crippled. He's very ill. I don't think it's ever really specified exactly what is happening.
They
with
never
Tiny
say
Tim.
Exactly, but he's definitely very ill.
It's possibly like polio. There's something with the limbs, and he's very sickly. And Scrooge, through watching them like be a loving family and kind of bonding with these people, he's there, but he really isn't. He can't be seen by them. He can observe them. Kind of just bonds with this child, and how easy it would be, the difference between Tiny Tim living a full life and them saving the crutch as a memory of this child. That's brutal. The imagery in this, it's brutal. It is really hard. But something so simple as just sharing some of your coin could save this child's life.
Well, for Scrooge, I mean, the decisions he makes are just business decisions. But this drives home to him the idea that, no, it's a question of life or death, the amount of money these people have to live off of. And Dickens certainly knew about poverty. And again, that's a recurring theme in a lot of his stuff. So much so that before we decided to call it A Christmas Carol, the original title of it was going to be An Appeal to the People of England on Behalf of the Poor Man's Child. It was an attack on management and poor treatment of their workers. He saw it entirely as that. Other people see it as a Christmas story. One way you know that was his original message was there's something odd that crops up, which is cut from almost every adaptation of it, which is ignorance and want.
Ignorance and want. The children of the Ghost of Christmas Present. The boy is ignorance, the girl is want.
The girl is want. He throws in these metaphors and literally calls them ignorance and want, and explains how dangerous they are. And
especially the boy.
Ignorance. There had been a series of revolutions in different countries around Europe at the time, and there was actually a fear in England in this time period the government could be toppled by a mob of angry rioters. There was a great poverty, and there was also a famine going on. It was known as the Hungry 40s, the 1840s. It was a time of social unrest and a tremendous feeling that things were kind of bad. And Dickens was attacking that whole feeling. But he's in the middle of this book in which he literally throws in these two obvious metaphors. Which kind of stick out like a sore thumb, which is why they're often dropped from most of the adaptations.
Oh, one of my favorite scenes is the beginning when Jacob Marley, kind of floats away out the window. And he looks out and he sees all of these ghosts with these chains, and it's all people he knows. And he said there's some that are chained together. It's the bad members of parliament and the bankers and basically anyone who made it hard for the life of the working poor man.
Exactly. It'd make it hard for the working poor. That was the whole theme of the book. Even though it seems to be glossed over in a lot of versions, I think the word Christmas is used more frequently in the adaptation than it is in the original book. It's obviously set at Christmas time.
Just happens
but the constant repetition of Merry Christmas and Keep Christmas All Year Round, those do appear in the book, but they're not repeated as often.
It happens at Christmas because that's the anniversary of Jacob Marley's death.
Exactly.
That's the only reason it happens at Christmas. And I think it is more of that, we're commercializing it. We're making it sweet. We're making it fluffy. We're making it about, basically it's the Grinch's heart growing 3 sizes instead of this is a very real story about the haves and the have-nots. I mean, anytime I read this, I wish the multi-millionaires and billionaires of this world would just be visited by some ghosts. That's
one of its part of its appeal.
Yeah.
Everybody has that wish when they hear the story, that would work that way in real life. Again, it's probably why the story is told again and again.
It's timeless. Like, you pick it up, even though it's taking place in the 1800s, it feels like a very modern story.
Yeah. It again, adaptations of it always use the modern trappings of Christmas. In the book, there are no Christmas trees, there are no Christmas decorations, because nobody did things like that in those days. The only Christmas trees were in Buckingham Palace, and they're the ones that were hung upside down from the ceiling, which is the German tradition.
Like Portal?
Yeah, believe it or not, that was brought over from Germany for the royal family. But yeah, the average person, although some people did apparently, but the average person, never have a Christmas tree, and there were no real Christmas decorations sold. There's a documentary about writing Christmas Carol, and the person says you could walk down a street in 1843 and never see a sign that it was Christmas.
Yeah.
And there's no mention of Christmas in the Times.
No, they just put like a sprig of holly over the door, and that's that. Our Christmas decorations are done. Well, especially in the impoverished areas, all you had were those natural plants that were springing up that you could pick on your way to work, and basically make the place look a little festive with a couple sprigs. That's what you were working with, and that's why those are the symbols of Christmas, because those are the plants that were still alive at that time.
Yeah, it was also interesting because a lot of the holiday traditions have a very adult nature to them, because originally Christmas was for adults.
Yeah.
It wasn't a children's holiday in those days, and that was one of the things that Dickens changed.
Yeah.
There's a book called The Man Who Invented Christmas, which is in the library. And it's made into a fairly mediocre movie, I felt. And a little bit exaggerates and dramatizes events in Dickens' life. The events are basically true. But to say he invented Christmas is kind of a misnomer, because C. Clement Cole had written "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" 20 years earlier.
Oh, really?
Yes. Night Before Christmas comes from 1820. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
So the whole Santa Claus thing was already laid down before Dickens. It just hadn't caught on yet.
Yeah.
But it would all get intertwined together, sort of snowball, and it become this huge holiday tradition that we now take for granted, even though almost none of our holiday things that we do are really ancient.
No, not unless, it's a pagan holiday.
Yeah, yeah. Originally, we know, it was famously banished by the Puritans. Massachusetts, it was illegal to celebrate Christmas. Oliver Cromwell not only banished Christmas, he made plum pudding illegal. Yep. And it was brought back when Cromwell and the Puritans were thrown out. But it never really caught on with the common folk. It remained a thing that was done in the royal palaces.
It's extravagant.
It's extravagant and expensive.
You would have to save all year to be able to do, half of the things. They're even talking about their Christmas meal, their Christmas feast, and Scrooge is saying that's a really small amount of food for the amount of people that they have. And it's basically just, you'd have to save for months just to get those little extra garnishes, to get the sage, to get the goose, Is
it the crackers that have a thin goose they describe?
They have a thin goose and a small pudding about the size of a cannonball.
Yeah, about the size of a cannonball. Oh, it's so sad.
They love it.
I know. Well, it's a huge feast to them. And they eat every bit of the goose, right down to the bones. Yeah.
They said there might have been just the tiniest little morsel of bone left.
Yeah. But hunger was a very real thing for the poor. Yeah. And again, it was something that Dickens knew about. I think because it has become so popular, the power of the book is kind of lost on modern audiences. It's hard for us to conceive of the kind of poverty they had in those days.
Well, I think the issue comes from people not reading it. Not reading it, but just sticking with not only the movie adaptations, but the more modern movie adaptations that really cut out the grit.
Yeah.
Because there is a real grit to this book.
It is, yeah. Dickens could write very dark stories. He doesn't hesitate to put a lot of that into this.
No, it's real, and that's the thing. piece that he writes, it does feel very real. There is this darkness, there's this heaviness.
Yeah.
This is definitely one of his lighter ones.
Yeah.
But there, especially when, describing the harsh realities, he does not sugarcoat the harsh realities.
Oh, yeah, yeah. He wrote several other Christmas stories, and none of them took off and became popular.
Yeah.
This was the only one. This was that magic golden moment that he had the perfect story that came out at the perfect time that everybody wanted to read.
He nailed that formula. Like,
it
was great.
He absolutely did. There was another version of it. You were talking about goblins earlier?
Yes. Okay. Yes. So there is a predecessor to this book, and it's a very similar story, and it does happen at Christmas, and it's called the Goblins That Stole the Sexton.
Okay.
Which it's instead of spirits that visit, it's 6 goblins. I have not read this book. I found out about this book through doing research for this book. I need to, because you were saying there's a lot of Christmas stories he did write.
Yeah.
I hadn't even heard of that. But goblins.
Yeah, goblins. Yeah. His publisher had no interest in it, so that's why he had to self-publish.
I mean, after trying to get across a bunch of books about goblins, I can see why he'd be hesitant. His publisher would be hesitant.
If the goblin version,
Charlie, it's got ghosts.
Yeah.
The goblins didn't work. The ghosts aren't going to work. Sorry, bud. I could see that conversation happening.
Yeah, it's not considered a ghost story, but in a lot of ways, it's so classic.
Yeah.
It really is a ghost story. A lot of horror
the
aspects.
Ghost story.
Yeah, clearly. All right. Any last thoughts?
It's a wonderful novel. If you have not read it, do yourself a favor. Read it. There's some really great things about class, about humanity, about compassion.
Yeah.
Wonderful things in this book. And if you haven't seen The Muppets Christmas Carol, watch it.
Muppets Christmas Carol is brilliant.
It's probably my favorite film adaptation. I'm not going to lie. They do a really great job.
It's the kind of story that needs to be done well.
Yeah.
And Michael Caine is a fabulous actor.
Michael Caine does an amazing job. And I don't know, I like that juxtaposition of a really dark story and the Muppets.
Yeah, and the characters are aware they're in a really dark story, too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, completely.
Yeah, I wouldn't put Gonzo freaks out and quits because he can't deal with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't.
It gets that bad, yeah.
The Muppets don't sugarcoat it as badly as some of the more modern tellings of it do.
Yeah. Leave it to the Muppets, and... Yeah, I mean, they get the right story and the right actors who can work with Muppets with the same intensity they would work with any other performance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Michael Caine definitely
had it. He was the right
it.
choice. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. But those are my closing thoughts. Read the book. Yeah. Watch the Muppets.
Yeah, get a complete uncut version because there are so many shortened versions of it around because, again, it's dismissed as a children's story.
I have done this stage production I've done 3 different versions of it, and each one is very, very, very different.
Yeah.
And they're all they all make sense within the novel. There's so much stuff that gets cut out.
It's a short story, not a short story. It's a novella, but there's so much in it, though. You can pick things from it and bring those to the front and have a really compelling story and leave other stuff behind.
Yeah, we're not talking about several characters within it. We haven't even touched on there's lots in this book.
Yeah, Dickens had that knack for creating characters, these sharp portraits of human beings in just a few sentences.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't even talk about his servants that steal all of his stuff when he dies.
Oh, God, they're horrible people.
But, no, it's great. Just read it.
Yeah.
Just read it.
Read it, and you'll probably enjoy it. And, try to forget most of the versions that you've seen because so many of them gloss over the hard details, except the Muppet Christmas Carol. All right. So until next time, I have been Ed.
I have been Michaela.
I will see you again in Booktalking, and until then, be safe.
Be happy, be healthy, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Bye.
Bye.